Report is that Chris Kojum is still a few minutes away, so we'll get underway. Thank you very much for your patience, and thank you very much for coming this morning. It's a pleasure for me to open up the program on Latin American revolutionary movements in the mid-20th century. I will introduce Chris, even though he's not here. I welcome him back to the center. He and I have worked together extensively over a period of a good many years. He was one of our key players on the staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee when I was chairman of that. He served as the deputy director of the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, the so-called 9/11 Commission. And then he served as the senior advisor to the Iraq Study Group, which Secretary Baker and I chaired a few years back. He has a very long record of serving in public office. 1984 to 1998, he was a staffer on that House Foreign Affairs Committee. 1998 to 2003, he served in the Department of State as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence Policy and Coordination in the Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Then he served on the 9/11 Commission and the Iraq Study Group. He combines the world of academia with his world of public policy. He was a visiting professor at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. He directed the Master of International Policy and Practice at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He took over his responsibilities as chairman of the National Intelligence Council last year in July. And before turning the program to Christian here in just a moment, I'll say a word about your meeting today, which the Wilson Center is delighted to host. This is the third in a series of conferences on the Center's history and public policy, and the National Intelligence Council together have organized on declassified national intelligence estimates, and the volume that you have in front of you, I guess, is the product of that. These conferences are designed to engage scholars and former and current officials in a dialogue on the quality and the utility of the intelligence judgments contained in the estimates. We hope that open and informed dialogue will help improve public policy and certainly deepen our understanding of significant episodes of recent international history. Past events here at the Center have dealt with U.S. intelligence assessments of China and the former Yugoslavia. We think they've been very successful. Today, as you know, the focus is on Latin America. We hope this renewed effort will continue in the future, and we expect it to, with additional releases and conferences. Christian Osterman deserves much of the credit here. He's the director of the Center's History and Public Policy Program. His deputy, Murtry Mutanu, and Jack Seymour of the National Intelligence Council, also a former Woodrow Wilson Center scholar, have worked closely with the Center staff to make this event possible. The event is also co-sponsored by the Latin American program at the Center, and I want to thank Cindy Arnson, its director, and her staff for their support. Christian, I'll turn it over to you while we await Mr. Kojum, and wish you all a very productive morning. Christian.
Thank you, Lee. Greatly appreciate you took the time to welcome all of you. Let me also welcome all of you on behalf of the History and Public Policy Program. My colleagues here, we're delighted to have all of you here. The History and Public Policy Program at the Wilson Center, as you know, focuses on the relationship between history and policymaking and seeks to foster open, informed, and nonpartisan dialogue on historically relevant issues. As President Hamilton mentioned, this program is co-sponsored with the Latin American program internally, directed by Cindy Arnson, and of course by the National Intelligence Council. Before I introduce the speakers, let me make a few introductory remarks. As Mr. Hamilton mentioned, this session is part of a longer-term collaborative effort. Good morning. Just introduce.
Chris, I've already introduced you, so you missed the nice things I said about you. All right.
Before I introduce the speaker, so let me make a few remarks. This session is part of a longer-term collaborative effort with the National Intelligence Council to engage scholars, former and current intelligence, community officials, policymakers, and others into a dialogue on the findings and judgments contained in the declassified NIEs. The purpose of these meetings has been to understand and assess these historical intelligence findings in light of what was known at the time and in light of what we know today. We hope there can be some lessons drawn from these discussions for analytic tradecraft, and we hope that scholars will benefit from these discussions and having access to these estimative products and to some of the people involved in producing them. As was mentioned, we had two earlier conferences, one on national intelligence estimates on China, under Mao, featuring former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, one on national intelligence estimates on the former Yugoslavia, at which former Secretary of State Eagleberger gave the keynote. For both of these conferences, we were able to bring leading scholars and experts from around the world to a full day of discussion, and the Center's Cold War International History Project compiled several companion document readers featuring new evidence from the former Soviet bloc archives and U.S. archives on these subjects. I think these were very productive and successful discussions, and both scholars and intelligence community representatives benefited from these meetings. We hope that we will be able to resume the conference series perhaps next year with a conference on Lebanon. Today's meeting is a somewhat abbreviated affair, but I hope that we can nonetheless get into a productive discussion of the set of 23 newly published intelligence estimates on Latin America. A few of the estimates have been available for some time at such organizations as the National Security Archive, but there's certainly a service to scholars and to the public to have them, as well as a good number of newly released materials compiled in one volume. Let me commend our colleagues at the National Intelligence Council under the leadership of Chris Kojim for the declassification and reproduction of these materials. It's a huge amount of effort that goes into putting such a volume out. The 23 estimative documents, of course, cannot be considered in and of by themselves. And one important task for today's meeting is to contextualize these documents and evaluate them in the historical setting of the time. In particular, inasmuch as these documents are preoccupied with Soviet, Cuban, local leftist and insurgent movements, we have to remind ourselves of the tortured history of U.S. engagement with Latin America, a history littered with instances and patterns of condescension, economic exploitation, hegemonic ambitions, and violent intervention on the part of the United States that began long before the Cold War started. We also need to embed these documents, these national intelligence estimates, in their Washington bureaucratic context. How do the findings found in these documents compare to what was known within other branches of the U.S. government, for example, the State Department? How do they compare to what we would call today open sources, in particular in academia and media at the time? And of course, as scholars, we would like to know what the debates were within the intelligence community about these issues raised in these estimates, and yes, what were the sources and methods through which the community arrived at these findings. Furthermore, what was the impact of the findings expressed in these national intelligence estimates on policymaking? How, if at all, did they affect, shape, reinforce perceptions and decision-making of the political leadership? Restrictions on access to the documentation of this process, from the information collection right through the working level analysis and discussion, remain in place. Many of you are aware of them, and so our ability to evaluate fully the significance of these estimates remains limited. We also have an opportunity today to look behind the former Iron Curtain, deep into the party Foreign Ministry, and yes, even intelligence archives of the former Soviet bloc. As many of you know, for the past nearly 20 years, the Center's Cold War International History Project, together with other research organizations, has been at the forefront of obtaining, declassifying, publishing these new evidence from the former communist world archives. With this material, it is possible today to reassess the accuracy of Western perceptions of Soviet bloc decision-making and actions, including, of course, the accuracy of Western intelligence findings on Soviet and Cuban intentions and policies vis-à-vis Latin America. Professor Glechesis has even managed to obtain access to Cuban documentation on many of these issues, and I hope he will share some of these findings today. So one question is, how do these estimates hold up in light of what we know today? And what lessons can we draw for the community's analytic tradecraft? Today's brief session can only be the beginning of a conversation, one that we hope to continue with further discussions, research, and publications. Final note of thanks before I introduce the speakers. I'd like to thank Jack Seymour from the National Intelligence Council for the cooperation organizing this conference, and my colleague Mircea Munteanu, as well as Tim McDonald and Christina Terzieva for helping to organize this conference, as well as our colleagues at the Latin America program. The director, Cindy Arnson, was mentioned already, but also Nikki Nichols, who's been very helpful in this endeavor. That gives me great pleasure to introduce our four speakers, but let me perhaps give Mr. Kojum a chance to make some opening remarks as well.
Thank you so much. My apologies for arriving late, and I will keep my remarks very brief. And the first thing I'd like to do is to thank the Wilson Center. The National Intelligence Council and the Wilson Center have had a long and remarkable cooperation on bringing declassified documents to the public's attention, and I am pleased to be here for the next step in that process. And as was mentioned, we hope to have Lebanon documents a year from now. The only other thing I want to say here at the outset is to recognize the work of the president of the Wilson Center, Lee Hamilton. I came to Washington in January of 1984 to work for Lee Hamilton. Apart from sojourns from time to time in the executive branch, I have always worked for Lee Hamilton. The other thing I'd like to note is he hired me to work on Eastern Europe. Within a week of my arrival, I was working on El Salvador and Contra aid. And so he and I have worked on the very issues before us for a long time. As all of you know, he is stepping down from the Wilson Center. He has had a remarkable career of public service. The nation is indebted to him. And we will return to this topic in a moment, but I do want all of you to join me in recognizing his outstanding public service. And I will.
It's not obligatory.
Well, I didn't know what you said about me before I arrived, but I took my chances. So let me return to the chair. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a terrific panel that Mr. Kojum and I will co-chair this morning. We'll be starting off with Mr. John Allen, 30-year veteran of the CIA, who served in operations, analysis, and the management of analysis. He served on the National Intelligence Council as National Intelligence Officer for Latin America, was director of the CIA's Office of African and Latin American Analysis, and edited several earlier collections from historically significant estimative products. He holds degrees from Virginia Tech, Harvard University, and the Air War College. We'll then turn to Mr. Patrick Marr, a 34-year veteran of the CIA as well, a Latin America specialist who served as analyst and manager of analysis before becoming National Intelligence Officer, NIO, in August 2005. He's lived in Brazil and Colombia and studied at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, holds degrees from the College of Worcester and Georgetown University, and was a Congressional Fellow in 1982-83. Then we have the great fortune to have with us Professor Rawdon Rowett. He is the Sarita and Don Johnston Professor at SAIS, Johns Hopkins, where he directs the Western Hemisphere Studies and Latin American Studies programs. He has been widely acclaimed for his contributions to Latin American studies, received the Order of Rio Branco from the government of Brazil with the rank of Commander, and the Order of Bernardo O'Higgins from the government of Chile with the rank of Grand Official. He is the author and editor of 18 books, including China's Expansion into the Western Hemisphere and Political Stabilization Politics in Latin America. His textbook, Brazil, Politics in a Patrimonial Society, is now in its 5th edition. He is a former national president of the Latin American Studies Association, has advised Chase Manhattan Bank, served as a faculty fellow at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland, and since 1999 has served as a consultant to the National Intelligence Council, period. He is also an independent director of a group of emerging market funds in New York and sits on the advisory council of the Centro de Investigación Latinoamérica Europa. Then I'm delighted to welcome back to the center somebody who's been long involved with the center's Cold War International History Project, Professor Piero Glejeses, leading authority on Cuban foreign policy, a professor of United States foreign policy in the Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, author of a number of books that relate directly to the subject that we're discussing today, including several on the role of U.S. intervention in Latin America, including an important book on the 1954 Guatemalan coup and the 1965 United States occupation of the Dominican Republic. In 2002, perhaps most best known to all of you, he published his book Conflicting Missions, Havana, Washington, and Africa, 1959 to 1976, on the Cuban involvement in the decolonization of Africa, which won the 2002 Robert Farrell Prize from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. In November 2003, the Cuban State Council decorated Glejeses with the Medal of Friendship at the initiative of the Cuban Institute of Friendship with the Peoples. With this very distinguished panel, we'll get on our way right off. First with John.
Thank you, Christian. For the record, I retired from CIA in 1995. I've been back doing this declassification work for the past 7 years. And my last job before retiring was as National Intelligence Officer for Latin America, as Christian said, and there are several former and recovering NIOs here in the we never quite recover, as you can see. We're here. This is, in fact, the 4th. This collection that I hope you all have, there are copies outside, is the 4th in a series. We did China under Mao, Yugoslavia under Tito, and we did Vietnam during the U.S. involvement. We did not have a conference on that. There were too many lessons not learned for Iraq and other places for there to be a conference, it was decided. In any event, and we're embarked on the 5th, I'm pleased to say. This is the first of the collections with a regional focus, as the title implies. The initial step in putting together a volume like this is to go to the archives and make sure there's a critical mass of documents to justify a collection. And you can see 600 pages. I blanch at that. I'm in the conservation movement. It bothers me. But 600 pages. Initially, we wanted to do the Caribbean and Latin America, but we couldn't. It was unmanageable. So we hived off the Caribbean and Mexico and It's a more traditional definition of Latin America, Central America, and the Cone countries. And it fit the resources we had much better than a broader study. Understand, there's just two of us. I had a co-editor here. He couldn't be here today. So there's two of us, retired CIA officers, doing this. And most of the time we spend working on freedom of information cases or requests that come in through the executive order channels, and we do this on the side. And then, of course, there's always the constraints of funding and, quite frankly, sheer size of these volumes. So we bounded it to be what it is. Let me address a few issues, and I'm going to be real quick here, that have come up in the previous two conferences in regard to the three collections. First, let me assure you, we did not cherry pick the documents in this collection. The bad and the ugly are here as well as the good, and I think Reardon alluded to some of the ugliness in his comments, and I'm sure others will too.
Very gently.
Very gently. Moreover, as with other documents, we only included, other collections rather, we only included those documents that we had evidence went to policymakers. The internal think pieces, and they're being produced all the time at the agency and elsewhere, that never left Langley or the other agencies, aren't here because they didn't have a potential impact on policy directly anyway. But we included two of these as appendices so you can see what they're like. This leads me to a very important point, and that is that this collection by no means represents the totality of intelligence analysis on this subject during the 40-year span of the collection. The constituent agency of the agencies, analysts and the constituent agencies of the intelligence community cranked out thousands, if not tens of thousands, of analytic pieces on this subject during the 40 years. Many of these went to top policymakers and had an impact, but our charter is to do the estimate of products, and that's what's here. A few words on what we took out or redacted from the documents here, and those few words are very little. There are a couple of three or four documents towards the tail end, largely dealing with Central America, where more time was spent detailing the sources of the evidence and the evidence than is usually the case with estimates, and because of that, you'll see some white space. The question of what is newly released in these documents, Christian alluded to that, is one that always comes up, and so I kept close track with this one, and I've been involved in all four and will be with the fifth of these collections. But in any event, there's 528 pages from these musty old documents in here. Of them, 294 or 56% are seeing the public light for the first time, or unclassified light for the first time. An important point here, those of you that have requested documents through Freedom of Information or the Executive Order channel, I'm a reviewer, so if I get a document to review for declassification purposes, the first thing I do is I look to see when it was reviewed last. And if it hadn't been reviewed in the past 2 years, there's a 2-year cutoff. It's been reviewed in the last 2 years. We have the option of sending that back to the requester. But if it's been more than 2 years, we're obliged to review it again. So if you recognize a document in here, don't assume that you've already read everything that's there. In each of the documents we looked at that bear white spaces, we released more than was previously the case. So, in wrapping things up, I want to also thank Chris Kojum for breathing new life into this program. His organization, like the CIA, have an obligation to respond to requests through the FOIA and executive order channel, but there's no obligation to put something like this out. This is a discretionary thing and reflects the NIC's commitment and the agency's commitment, when and where possible, to make these sorts of documents available to scholars and to the general public to help educate them on this intelligence process. And finally, there are lots of people at CIA, at the NIC, and at the Wilson Center who work behind the scenes hard to put these out, whose names haven't been mentioned. Jack Seymour is one of those, and the other is Sydney, who works in the office that I'm in, who was copy editor par excellence for this. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Marr?
As Christian mentioned, I'm Pat Marr. I'm a retired CIA analyst. I'm on the panel because I was the National Intelligence Officer for the Western Hemisphere when this project was conceived and largely completed. Would like to thank Reardon Rowett for authoring an excellent introduction. It skillfully intertwines the key themes in the compendium with the policy context in which the events transpired. I'm also pleased that Piero Gliesis agreed to comment on the compendium. He's delved deeply into the subject and doubtless will have some provocative comments. I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words about a topic I've worked on episodically during my career in the intelligence community. The compendium's dominant theme is Cuba's support for the armed struggle in Latin America and for a briefer period in Africa. The documents trace the armed struggle through three separate stages. First, immediately after Fidel Castro took power in January of 1959 through the late 1960s. The second, from the late 60s through the late 70s. And then the third stage from the late 70s until 1987 when the final two documents were published. One of the documents describes Castro's strategy in the first stage as a reckless, indiscriminate approach in which he tried to export his successful insurgency to a broad range of countries. Castro launched this approach almost immediately after taking office by sending small rebel forces to Nicaragua, Panama, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. During the first stage, members of the Cuban government expressed the belief that objective conditions for revolution were not necessary. Instead, insurgents with Cuban aid could create such conditions. Political will and revolutionary fervor could be decisive, it was felt. By 1964, Castro had become more selective, especially targeting countries that showed revolutionary promise: Venezuela and Bolivia in South America and Guatemala in Central America. But revolutionaries in Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Chile, and several countries in Central America and the Caribbean continued to merit some Cuban assistance. The capture and killing of Che Guevara on October 8, 1967 marked the beginning of the end of the first phase. The cost to Cuba of Che's debacle was steep. Accompanying him were 16 veteran Cuban combatants, including 3 members of the Cuban Communist Party Central Committee. They were theoretically the best team Havana could field, as the documents note. Che's demise allowed him to join the pantheon of the revolutionary heroes, along with Camilo Cienfuegos and Frank Pais, but demolished the contention that an outside force could create revolutionary conditions. And it underscored to Cuban leaders a lesson they never forgot: the importance of a united leftist movement to enable insurgency to thrive. Soviet pressure weighed heavily in Castro's decision to abandon the scattershot approach, according to the documents. Havana began to pay greater heed at home to Carlos Rafael Rodriguez and other old communists, and however painfully, to strengthen relations with local communist parties in Latin America. During the second phase of the export revolution, Havana's assistance to the armed struggle reached a low ebb. In Jorge Castañeda's words, these were the dog years for Manuel Piñero and his America Department. Armed struggle as a route to power in Latin America seemed doomed. The election of Salvador Allende in Chile in November 1970 bolstered the idea that a revolutionary government could come to power through means other than violence. This point, of course, has gained added meaning in recent years with electoral victories of Chavez in Venezuela, the other Bolivarian leaders, and even Daniel Ortega. Allende's triumph gave Castro his first ally at the presidential level in Latin America. From late 1970 through September 1973, Castro was preoccupied with the ultimately unsuccessful effort to help Allende consolidate power and avoid being overthrown. Accepting the new realities in the hemisphere, Cuba shifted temporarily to a new, more propitious region for revolutionary change through its increasing involvement in Africa. The documents give cursory treatment to that story, but note that Cuba's accomplishments, particularly in Angola, were crucial to enabling it to claim the mantle of leadership in the non-aligned movement. In Latin America and in such Caribbean countries as Manly's Jamaica and Forbes Burnham's Guyana, Castro's emphasis in the 1970s on building government-to-government ties helped Cuba escape its isolation. Indeed, one of the documents assesses that at the end of 1979, Cuba's international influence had never been greater. The third period, from 1979 to 1987, saw a reversion by Castro to full-bore support to the armed struggle, this time in Central America. Changing domestic circumstances, particularly the assassination of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro and the alienation of Nicaragua's small but influential middle class, placed the Sandinistas in a position to seize power militarily. As Castañeda notes, the Sandinista victory was Che's final vindication. A combination of hardliners and relatively broad-based insurgent movements in El Salvador and Guatemala offered Havana new opportunities to further expand its role. The Central American insurgencies are well-plowed territory in academic studies, but the 5 documents that deal with Central America uniquely describe how the intelligence community assessed evolving trends there. A significant gap is the nearly 4-year period from 1977 to 81. This gap deprives the reader of an opportunity to evaluate, first, the accuracy with which the intelligence community tracked the Sandinistas' growing strength in early 1979 as they prepared for their final offensive against Somoza. And secondly, the extent of Cuban involvement in counseling and assisting FSLN leaders. These issues, at least in my way of thinking, are particularly significant because of the debate in the U.S. government at that time about what course the Sandinista revolution might take and how open Nicaraguan leaders were to U.S. advice. The Central American documents resume the story in in June of 1981, focusing on the potential takeover by radical leftist insurgents in El Salvador and Guatemala. Several of the documents describe how quickly after the Sandinistas took power, Nicaragua, with Cuban participation, was transformed into, quote, the hub of the revolutionary wheel in Central America. El Salvador became a Cold War battlefield as weapons reached Salvadoran insurgents via Nicaragua from 4 Eastern European countries, as well as Ethiopia, the PLO, and most importantly, Vietnam, from the leftover U.S. stockpile. Even small numbers of North Koreans lent a hand in helping the Sandinistas consolidate their hold. This Central American story, as I've said before, is not new, but the details will prove useful to scholars. The analysis of the Guatemalan insurgency in the documents stands up well in retrospect, in my view. The discussion of the socioeconomic and racial factors that fueled Guatemala's insurgency is nuanced, and the judgment that the Guatemalan insurgents were less of a threat to take power than were their Salvadoran counterparts is persuasively argued. The documents correctly assess that Cuba had ties to almost all the insurgent groups. I'm now switching to the final 2 documents that deal with insurgency in South America. The documents correctly assess that Cuba had ties to almost all the insurgent groups in South America, but its support was much less critical in sustaining them than was the case in Central America. In Colombia, Cuba advised and trained the ELN, and for a shorter period, the M-19, but was less well connected to the dominant insurgent group, the FARC. The documents published in July 1986 and May 1987, respectively, identify factors that in subsequent years made the FARC the most potent insurgent group since Castro's rebel force. First, millions of dollars of cocaine-generated revenue fueled FARC coffers, and second, the failure by a succession of governments in Bogota, A, to strengthen Cuba's counterinsurgency forces, and B, to broaden the political system, allowed the FARC to prosper. In Peru, The intelligence community had no reliable or no credible evidence of cooperation between Cuba and Sendero Luminoso, that country's most lethal insurgent group. Sendero remains a unique phenomenon among Latin American revolutionary groups in its particular blend of Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism. It considered Castro's Cuba revisionist and pro-Soviet. Then President Alan Garcia's vacillating efforts to confront Sendero Luminoso, as described in the documents, point to a factor that later would become decisive in Peru and even more so in Colombia, and that is the presence of a president determined to shape and sustain an effective counterinsurgent effort. One could say a great deal about the legacy of the armed struggle for today's Latin America, a legacy that one sees in human terms at all levels and in a broad array of Latin American governments. But that subject is for another day or perhaps for another speaker.
Thank you. We now turn to Professor Roy.
Thank you very much.
Use the mic. No, just make sure you speak into it.
Of course.
We're webcasting this event, so
You didn't tell me that.
it's important to use the microphone.
In reading the first set of documents that I reviewed to write the introduction, I developed a great deal of sympathy, for the analysts who were working in an extraordinary political vacuum in Washington in the mid-late 1940s and early 1950s. And in doing the research, and this is the first part of my comments do not reflect the documents, reflect my own thinking about the framework within which the estimates were written, the United States paid scant attention to Latin America after World War II. There was the Chapultepec Conference in 1945, Bogota in 1948, the Organization of American States. But Secretary of State Marshall attended the Bogota Conference in 1948 and made it very clear there would be no economic support for social or economic development or change in Latin America. Those resources would go to Asia and to Europe, the Marshall Plan, of course. In February 1946, we had the long telegram from Ambassador Kennan creating the containment framework, and then Prime Minister Churchill's Iron Curtain speech a few days after the long telegram came to be. And probably the last significant decision was the Rio Pact in September of 1947 with regard to security in the Americas. But a complaint many of us have in 2010 is that people at the senior levels don't really know very much about Latin America in any administration of either political party, which I think is quite true. And I'll give you a few quotes of the late 1940s and 1950s, why working at the agency and writing these estimates, you would wonder if they would ever get to anybody in authority. Adolf Berle, who was a leading specialist, of course, after World War II, noted in his own writings a lack of interest in the Americas, a growing lack of interest in the Americas with dismay. Quote, "Men in high office who know the hemisphere and love it are few," he said as early as 1945, "and those who are known by the hemisphere and loved by it are fewer still." By 1949, the situation had grown still worse, Berle thought, complaining about, quote, "sheer neglect and ignorance," unquote. He declared that, quote, "we have simply forgotten about Latin America," unquote. George Kennan went to Latin America in 1950 and offered his view on U.S. policy objectives in the region. Quote, "First, the protection of raw materials. Second, the prevention of military exploitation of Latin America by the enemy, the Soviet Union. And third, the prevention of the psychological mobilization of Latin America against us," unquote. He stated that communists, quote, "represent our most serious problem in the area," and, quote, "they have progressed to the point where they must be regarded as an urgent major problem," 1950. There was then two final quotes that I think are interesting, again, not from the estimates, but from scholarship and writing about the area. Kennan, after his 1950 trip to Latin America, reported back to Washington that the, quote, "subconscious recognition of the failure of group efforts finds its expression in an exaggerated self-centeredness and egotism, in a pathetic urge to create the illusion of desperate courage, supreme cleverness, and a limitless virility where the more constructive virtues are so conspicuously lacking," unquote. Kennan's conclusion, like that of an earlier political leader, John Quincy Adams, and President Adams was too overwhelmingly pessimistic in his time in the White House. Quote, "It seems unlikely that there could be any other region of the earth in which nature and human behavior could have combined to produce a more unhappy and hopeless background for the conduct of human life than in Latin America," unquote. And finally, discussing Dwight Eisenhower's trip to Latin America in 1952 with Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. He agreed it was a good idea for Dr. Eisenhower to travel to Latin America, but the Secretary is quoted as saying that, quote, "You have to pat them a little bit and make them think you are fond of them," unquote. So the framework, post-1945 framework in which the estimates were written must have been a very discouraging period of time in which Latin America basically disappeared from the foreign policy, security, and international relations agenda of the United States. So we basically forgot Latin America. The people at the top forgot Latin America and turned to Asia and Europe, probably for good reasons, although there's constant concern now to the estimates about a Soviet presence in the region. This is pre-1959. But what is interesting in the first set of documents before Mr. Castro entered Havana in 1959 was the very, very prescient analysis of the analysts. At this period, none of whom I had trained, but they certainly wrote the kinds of things I was thinking about when I did become a Latin American analyst. First, and very early on, the failure of local elites in the region to address poverty, inequality, and the lack of justice. No structural reform. And these were just reporting on the facts as the analysts understood them in the region. The old order was fading, the estimates say. Instability is bound to occur. There's mounting pressure for radical political change in the region. Radical nationalism, using Juan Domingo Perón as an interesting example, is now becoming more prevalent in the region, the estimates argue. They also argued that there were new dynamics in the region. A new order was emerging, import substitution, industrialization, more aggressive labor unions, and the beginnings of civil society action demanding reform and change. That, of course, as the estimates point out, came to naught in 1954 when the U.S. supported the overthrow of President Arbenz in Guatemala. But what is interesting about the writings in the beginnings from 45 to up to 59 is the understanding of the lack of reform, the lack of commitment by Latin American elites. Now, the larger question, not in the estimates that I would raise, is what if Secretary Marshall and President Truman had decided that a Marshall Plan was necessary for Latin America? Would that indeed have provided support for the elites to introduce structural change? Knowing the region since 1962, my answer probably would have been no. The elites were too well established, and as John Quincy Adams said, an unhappy crowd, very much given to the way they lived and their parents, grandparents, and forebears lived in Latin America. Peasants, indigenous people, people of color just did not really count in terms of the way in which the elites in Latin America reacted to the emerging new realities. And that, of course, would begin with a series of coups d'etat in Brazil in 1964, followed by many of the countries in South America in the succeeding decade, ending, of course, with the overthrow of President Salvador Allende in 1973 and the onstart of the Pinochet regime. The lack of structural reform, the attempt to tie organized labor to political parties or to the state, the inability to organize in the countryside. Unionization only began really in the early 1960s, which led to a radicalization both in Chile and Brazil in particular. And the estimates reflect these realities on the ground. The people writing the estimates can't change these realities, but they were very, very right on in passing along information to policymakers who should have been more understanding, perhaps more responsive to what the estimates say about the realities on the ground in Latin America. John Quincy Adams was quite right about the elites in Latin America in the 1940s, 50s, and 1960s. Not that Mr. Adams knew Latin America, but I guess he had some good reports. His estimates must have been rather good as well, coming from whatever agency there was in Washington when John Quincy Adams was the President of the United States. And I'm sure there was one. The estimates change, of course, after 1959, rightfully so. The emergence of Fidel Castro after Caracas, after Mr. Nixon's trip to Latin America and his Caracas adventures, he reported back, of course, to Washington that the communists were behind what had happened to his entourage in Caracas, Venezuela. The U.S. then began to react very late with the creation of the Inter-American Development Bank in 1959. The Act of Bogota created the Social Progress Trust Fund in 1960. John F. Kennedy in the early 60s created the Alliance for Progress. We then began to go into a new dynamic, which the estimates very nicely reflect, particularly after the failure of the Bay of Pigs. Once again, right on, changing social dynamics in Latin America. The revolution in Cuba merely highlights the inability of those in power to address the basic underlying problems of education, health, housing, which of course are the basic issues of 2010 in many of the countries in Latin America. The estimates also point out the changing role of the military in Latin America after 1959. Is the military the same old military that supported the elites in the 1940s and 1950s? And as we learned in some, not all countries, beginning in 1964, the military in Brazil, with their intervention, certainly began to change the model for the better, for the worse. That still is very much a matter of debate. But the militaries were becoming increasingly aggressive in terms of responding to elite demands that they overthrow the radical parties that were emerging in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The estimates obviously very carefully document the attempts by President Castro to exploit the revolution, as Pat Marr has very clearly indicated. There's a very interesting communique in May of 1963 in the Kremlin between President Castro and Premier Khrushchev on the role of the Soviet Union in Latin America. And again, the estimates very carefully analyze and pick that up. And once again, in the 1970s, the estimates go back to a very important theme. The real threat in the region, the estimates say, to the existing order is unemployment, the unemployed and the underemployed. Insurgency are not successful, but the on-the-ground possibilities for further insurgencies, given the absence of reform, structural change, is indeed going to be a reality for the United States policy for some time to come. The estimates also point out that the position of the United States was eroding in the region, with the rise of regimes that were not necessarily anti-American, but they certainly weren't very pro-American the way they were after the 1940s and 50s. And the interesting issue, which the estimates do argue, as a matter of fact, is the way in which the elites maintain U.S. support is that they argue that structural change, of course, would be debilitating to stability. And most importantly, the elites argued they were important to prevent communism being spread in the Americas. And Washington, bipartisan Washington, bought that line, unfortunately, in the 1950s and 1960s. The estimates take another turn after the assassination of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro in January 1978. Somoza's out in July of 1979. President Jimmy Carter issues his certification in September of 1980. And, of course, the 1980s are the decade of real insurgency, civil war, combat. And in 1981, the new president of the United States, Ronald Reagan, issues a presidential finding in which covert action by the CIA in Central America is permitted and indeed encouraged. And we open up the famous Contra Honduras, El Salvador, etc., contretemps that occupies most of the 1980s. The National Security Council in November of 1981 here in Washington gave official support for the Contras. And in 1981-82, there's an emerging sense of crisis, which is reflected in the analysis, in the estimates, by those who are writing them. 1982, one of the estimates argues it's going to be a long haul in addressing the Soviet-Cuban alliance. But things begin to turn with the election of Mr. Duarte in El Salvador, with the Contadora negotiations, which were not very popular in the 1980s in official Washington, the Manzanillo effort as well to negotiate, and the Europeans and the South Americans became increasingly involved in dealing with these issues. And as Pat Marr said, by the middle of the 1980s, and the estimates then stopped that I reviewed, you begin to have under Mr. Garcia in Peru, the Sendero Luminoso, and the FARC, of course, are emerging in Colombia. A second set of documents, when released post-86-87, would deal with these very interesting issues, and it raises the question again, which the estimates do not deliberately raise, but going back to the very early estimates that were written in the mid and late 1940s and 1950s, that it was the failure of local elites to address poverty, inequality, and the lack of justice, the inability to introduce structural reforms that are going to create very serious problems in the Americas for the United States, and indeed that proved to be all too true. Lessons for today, if the elites are listening, move on with the agenda of the late 1940s and early 1950s, lest we have more regimes like that of Mr. Chavez, Mr. Correa, Mr. Ortega, who's returned for a second spotlight tour in Nicaragua, and, of course, President Morales. Very different regimes, all are characteristic of the anti-American movement, the anti-Washington consensus, and all of whom argue that they have come to power to introduce these structural reforms that the elites refused to do in the 40s and 50s. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very incisive review. We now turn to Professor Glachesis.
After Riordan's excellent presentation, the safest thing for me is to be brief. I will focus just on the 1960s and on Cuba. And what I want to say is that when I read the reports of CIA analysts and the people from INR, the Intelligence and Research of the Department of State, not just what is in this book, but many others that have been declassified, I am struck by how lucid, how intelligent they are when they try to deal with Cuban foreign policy. And these on two grounds. First of all, when they discuss what are the motivations of Cuba's revolutionary activism, which they essentially do for Africa and Latin America at the same time, is two sides of the same coin. And they mention Fidel Castro's ego, but they don't consider it an important reason. They never mention the Soviet Union, that Cuba may be acting on behest of the Soviet Union. They see really two major force motivations for Cuba's revolutionary activism. And the first one is self-defense. The reports of the CIA, INR are very frank in stating that between 1961 and 1964, Cuba tried on repeated occasions to start conversations with the United States for a modus vivendi, and the United States consistently rejected them. I was just rereading yesterday evening an excellent report by Tom Hughes, who was in 1964 the director of INR. So what was Cuba's response? Then Cuba's response was to challenge the United States where they could do it. Obviously, they couldn't do it by launching paramilitary raids against Miami, however morally justified, would have been suicidal. They even refused to give military training to African Americans who came to Cuba. They were sent to Africa because it would be too provocative. The Cuban response was in Africa and Latin America. The CIA and INR understood this very well. Again, to go back to Tom Hughes, his report when Che Guevara went to Africa, his famous three-month trip at the end of 1964. And analysts working on Latin America and on Africa essentially said the same thing. They want to lessen the pressure on Cuba, create friendly government along these lines. Essentially, they said what Che Guevara, second in command in Zaire, said perhaps in a more poetic way. Los Yankees nos estaban acosando, nos fuimos a enfrentarlos por los caminos del mundo. The Yankees were pressing us, they were attacking us. We went to challenge them along the paths of the world. But this is only one motivation. And to the credit of the analysts at CIA and the INR, they did not stop to this one motivation. Would have been looking at someone running with just one leg. There was a second key motivation, according to the analysts at CIA and INR, and that is what they call the sense of revolutionary mission of the Cuban leadership. Report after report of CIA, INR, talk of Fidel Castro as a compulsive revolutionary, with a fanatical devotion to his cause, inspired by messianic sense of mission, engaged in a great crusade to help free the people of the third world from the misery and the oppression that tormented them. When I read this CIA statement to a friend of mine, a Cuban official in Havana, he was purring like a cat. He couldn't have agreed more with the analysis of CIA. So these are, again, the two major explanations that the CIA gives and INR for Cuban activism. And again, in my view, is an excellent analysis. The second point where I'm very impressed by their analysis is on Cuba's relationship with the Soviet Union. They never argue that Cuba behaves in the third world as a proxy of the Soviet Union. Actually, CIA INR reports stress the independence of Cuban foreign policy. There is one I will not read. I wish you had included in the book, because it's from the Board of National Estimates, Bolsheviks and Heroes, the USSR and Cuba. And it's even written in a very witty way, in stressing really how the Cubans are mistreating the Soviets, and basically how the Cubans are criticizing everything of the Soviets, including their domestic politics, plus not enough aid to North Vietnam, Soviet attitude in the Middle East conflict, etc., etc., etc. And when I reread this document of the CIA, which is one among many, it reminded me of something that Raúl Castro said in January 1978 in Addis Ababa, when he spent 3 days talking with Mengistu. When looking back at the relationship with the Soviet Union, he said, if they gave us any advice, we would say that they were interfering in our internal affairs. But we didn't hesitate to express our opinions about their internal affairs. And that's completely true and really highlights the relationship. And again, to the credit of the US intelligence agencies, they were able to understand this. And this leads me to my third and last essentially point. There is really a gap, at least when we're talking of the 60s, and not just for Latin America, for Africa also. I'm thinking of, for instance, the Congo 1964, between the sophisticated judgment of the analysts and then the US policymakers. And quite frankly, the analysts deserved better policymakers. I don't keep this analysis for the 1970s, 1980s, because I've not seen enough documents. Not enough documents have been declassified to allow me to make this kind of analysis. My very superficial impression is that actually the quality of the analysis went down somewhat. But this is a very tentative assessment. So I end here.
Thank you very much, Piero. With that, the floor is open for your questions and comments. If you could please wait for the microphone. Yes, for the microphone, so that our viewers, listeners over the webcast will be able to follow the discussion. We'll go to the gentleman up front here. If you could please, in Wilson Center tradition, state your name and affiliation, if you like.
Norman Bailey, Institute of World Politics, formerly National Security Council and Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Two questions having to do with this extremely interesting and enlightening discussion. One has to do, and of course I have not read the volume, although I intend to devote at least the next 3 years of my life to going through it. One was the remark by Pat Marr that a very important period of the development of the Sandinista movement in Nicaragua is not reflected in the documents, and I would be interested in knowing why that is the case. And secondly, I assume from the comments that what I believe personally to have been the beginning of many of these movements, the very first one, and which is still a scourge of the country in which it occurred, namely Peronism in Argentina, is not covered by these documents. And again, I would like to know whether that's simply because it was excluded on purpose, or whether there are no such documents, or what.
Excellent question.
John may want to start,
Yeah.
and then I can weigh in.
The documents here are the ones that treat revolution, insurgency from a regional perspective. They do not include what I would call the country-specific documents. Indeed, there were papers on Peronism in Argentina and on the early days of the Sandinistas, but lots of them put out by ONE and the National Intelligence Council, I guess, on Nicaragua, and by DI, the analytic component of CIA. But these are just the documents that looked at the region in a broader fashion, not the country-specific ones. I mean, we'd have a stack that big, and it would take you 10 years instead of 3.
To go back to a point John made at the beginning, and that is a lot of analysis goes on that's not from the National Intelligence Council. I remember that period after the Bowdler mission failed when we were doing a tremendous amount of support to Assistant Secretary Pete Vakey, a really knowledgeable person about Latin America. It seemed like every other day he would want another memo. So there was plenty that was being done in the trenches during that period, just not so much at the National Intelligence Council level.
But, you know, that's an interesting point because the estimates, interesting point because the estimates, not all of them, and maybe only a fraction of them are ordered up by policymakers. So, and they want a consensus or the consensus view out of the community on a given topic. So if they're not there, to get back to Reardon's point about lack of interest, they weren't ordered up in many cases. Often estimates are volunteered, but often they're ordered up.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, Frank Fletcher. I'm an independent researcher on international relations. My question is, do the documents or reflect any understanding of the evolution of the relationship between the KGB and Cuban intelligence? It seems to have changed after the microfaction, and that's kind of opaque, my understanding of it. Some say that it was, Castro claims it was his own counterintelligence that detected this plot. Others argue that it was the Soviet intelligence that revealed this to him, but certainly the relationship and the funding changes after that, and what are the reasons why it changed and why was it different before, and anything you could have on that?
Could you please just quickly explain the microfaction and what you just alluded to, since we have a broad audience?
Well, there were a group of basically old people that had been part of the pre-Castro Communist Party, the Partido Socialista Popular, the PSP, and I'm having a senior moment remembering the leader of that.
Escalante.
Yes, yeah, thank you. And they were going to seize power, and they were arrested. And the question is, how were they detected? Certainly if it was the Soviets that detected it, some say it was because they went to the Soviets, and others say the Soviets put them up to it, but it's not clear. But
thank you. Piero?
All I can say is I don't think they were going to seize power. It was more like a study circle of people who had no contacts with military, had no strength or anything. And I don't think, from my very limited knowledge, I don't think that the Soviets rattled to Castro about them or anything. I think they were discovered by Cuban intelligence. And quite frankly, I don't think it was very difficult to discover them because they were talking among themselves and this was known and so on. So that's all I can say.
Have you seen documentary evidence on this?
On what?
No,
not at all. Just talking with people.
Okay. Anybody else would like to respond?
I don't remember anything in the documents that addresses that issue. Frankly, it's not the kind of issue that a national intelligence estimate would deal with unless it were in an appendix or something like that. It's a kind of topic that would more likely be covered in current intelligence or shorter papers in either INR, CIA, or DIA, rather than in a national intelligence estimate.
Thank you. John Prados, yeah. On this side.
John Prados.
Hold on, wait for the microphone, please.
John Prados, National Security Archive. Agency analysts on the Soviet Union and on Yugoslavia, when you presented here, were very reflective not only about what was in the national intelligence estimates, but also places where they fell short and where intelligence analysis was went in the wrong direction or wasn't completely executed and whatnot. And I would like to hear intelligence analysts discuss what were the shortcomings of the NIEs on Latin America.
Thank you. Like to take a
Can you
stab?
repeat the question you would like to hear?
What were the shortcomings of the estimates?
Discuss what's not in the NIEs on Latin America. Discuss what things you failed to look at or didn't appreciate sufficiently well.
Obviously, that's a question that would require some thinking. What occurs to me more?
Thinking about this for 30 years.
Pardon?
We need to have the microphone, otherwise this conversation is lost on our viewers. And so please return the microphone to John, just so we can finish this.
I'm sure it's true of every executed action that people think about its consequences and what were the alternative potential outcomes of those things forever on after. I don't think that you need 30 years from now to think about this. I think you must have some impressions of what were the strengths and the weaknesses of intelligence estimates on Latin America that you can discuss.
Well, I've already mentioned one thing that I think was a strength. I think the coverage of Guatemala in the various estimates was extremely well done in terms of allowing the reader to understand the underlying social causes of the insurgency. I guess another specific, but it wasn't from an NIE, was I thought our coverage of the FARC over the years overall was pretty good. The one thing that I personally tended to underestimate at the time, although it seems like a no-brainer now, is the money that was coming into the coffers of the FARC from the drug sales. I think that changed a movement which was pretty parochial, pretty much confined to the Llanos, the Eastern Plains, into a movement with a national presence. And that was because the money allowed them to purchase the arms that enabled them to establish that presence.
I know one charge against the intelligence community is failure to anticipate what happened in Nicaragua with Daniel Ortega's emergence on the scene. And fortunately, we have a former NIO who was there during at the time in the form of Bob Vickers down there. So, Bob, do you want to comment on that? He needs the mic. He needs the mic, yeah.
I mean, it's hard for me without going back and reading some of these myself to say what we got wrong. But it was, I mean, I think Christian's opening remarks, I view the 80s as a very interesting period for Latin America. The Sandinistas and the Contra issue was a politically charged one. And every estimate that we did in the 80s was, to some extent, under a microscope by the intelligence committees, from, in many cases, different sets of glasses. So we were very conscious of the fact that what we were writing could have policy implications, and we tried as much as we could to appear as objective and professional as we could in crafting those estimates. And I think, quite frankly, I think we did a pretty good job, but I know in the case of one of the estimates here, the one on the Sandinista support for regional insurgencies, there was even a HIPC post-mortem kind of investigation of that estimate to see if the Reagan administration had tried to influence the conclusions. And fortunately, they gave us a clean bill of health. That there was no evidence that that DCI Casey at the time, kind of wrote the conclusions for us, but I guess I'm not answering your specific question about the strengths and weaknesses. I'm trying to say a little bit about the fact that there was a very strong political context to the estimates that were done in the 80s, both in terms of the Cuban and the Soviet and the Sandinista role.
And picking up on what Bob
John,
said
the
about,
microphone.
I'm sorry. Picking up what Bob said about the estimates being under a microscope is interesting. If you go through this volume, you'll see that when you get to that period, that's where the white space is. And that reflect the fact that they were really laying out the evidence and the sources of evidence and estimates in a way that's unusual during this period. But my understanding, and I was not running the Office of African Latin American Analysis at the time in the Directorate of Intelligence within the CIA, and analysts from there drafted large chunks of these estimates from here, is we didn't have enough resources on Central America. We didn't have enough analysts looking at the area. It was a resource question. I think our friend John, Pat, maybe was the only one, and he was part-time on Nicaragua. That's not enough. But as a manager of resources against analysis, you're doing this, and you don't always get it right. It's a fact of life. And we did not. In the period prior to Somoza's fall and Ortega and the Sandinistas' arrival, have enough resources watching it. That's one area. I'm sure there are others.
John, it just reminds me of an anecdote, and then I'll get back to the question. When Mr. Casey took over as DCI, he came down to our working spaces and wanted to see the war room. There was no war room. There was 2 or 3 hours later, but at the time there wasn't. Reflects John's comment. I guess I personally would not be at all defensive about our record during the 79 through the early 80s period. I think at a time, particularly 78 through, or 79, 80, when there was tremendous skepticism in our embassy in Managua about whether the Sandinistas would get involved in export of the revolution and what the composition of the government was. That is to say, how seriously one should take the junta as opposed to the national directorate. I think we were prescient in what we said on both those issues, that the Sandinista directorate was where the action was, that there was a heavy Marxist outlook from that group, that the Sandinistas would get involved, obviously with Cuban support, in exporting their revolution almost immediately to the rest of Central America, Guatemala and El Salvador. We did a trilogy of 3 papers right away, analyzing what would likely happen. And again, that may seem like a no-brainer in retrospect, but at the time there was a substantial amount of suspicion about what we were doing. Politicization is an issue that always comes up, and it reminds me of one particular story, and I'll try to be general enough so I'm not revealing anything. We did a study once on whether arms were going from Nicaragua to El Salvador, and the head of our agency didn't think it was a very persuasive case. And one always thinks we can do better, and so we went back to the drawing boards and did better. And the DCI still wasn't satisfied with it and wanted another round, and we did a 3rd round. And made as persuasive case as anyone could imagine. And to the office director's credit, she said to the DCI, this is as good as you're going to get, and there's going to be real suspicion about politicization if it doesn't go forward. And to the DCI's credit, it did go forward. So there was enormous pressure on politicization, but we've always said in the intelligence community, the policy community cannot politicize us. It's the analysts that, if you bow to that pressure, that that do the politicizing, and I think that's deeply embedded in our group. Our group meaning the intelligence community analytic core.
I would even say fiercely embedded. Yeah.
All right. We, okay. Immediately on this issue, yeah, Cindy. Okay, let's go to Cindy Arnson then.
Cindy Arnson with the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center. I'm struck by a number of the comments so far about the extent to which the analysts got it right in analyzing Latin America and what was wrong. And I'd like to sort of carry forward to this issue of politicization of intelligence in the 1980s. What's striking, I think, in looking back, I haven't had a chance to go through this collection, but looking through other documents that have been declassified, was the choice of subject matter for the for intelligence work. There is a lot of tasking on Sandinista supportive insurgency, on Cuban supportive insurgency, on revolutionary movements, and a relative dearth, if not a complete lack of attention to the sources of right-wing terrorism, particularly in El Salvador at the time. And so my question really is, how do you define the questions that drive the product? And what is the influence of politics on the choice of questions that you ask as you carry out, as you determine what issues need to be investigated by the intelligence community?
Excellent question.
The specific of your question, all kinds of papers are written on right-wing terrorism in El Salvador during the period when that was a problem. I'm not sure how much of that was in National Intelligence Council produced papers, but in the trenches we wrote on that issue, and clearly not as much as we wrote about export of the revolution, but there was no way that you could avoid that question. It was so important on the national scene in El Salvador. The D'Aubusson period in particular.
Yeah, Cindy, let me say a word on this. It's more pertinent today and the current situation, but it was also true, I am certain, in the 1980s, and that is that the intelligence community at senior levels will focus most of its work and attention on policymaker questions and priorities. That's just the way it's going to be, and frankly has to be, that the community exists to support the policymaker and make sure that they have the best possible information for decisions. I think that's all pretty self-understood. The other point I would make is that certainly today, and I'm sure it was true in the 1980s, that in the intelligence community we also have a responsibility to focus on topics that the policymaker doesn't ask and that we think are important to bring to their attention. Now, that's a smaller subset than the daily stream of products in response to questions, but we really have both responsibilities.
The one thing that sticks in my mind, and I can't prove it, but I think it's probably accurate, is when there was a shift in administrations from Jimmy Carter to President Reagan. I think the feeling, at least that I got, about the DCI Casey's attitude was, I understand the social causes of insurrection in the region. You don't need to tell me about that. What I want to know is the kinds of questions we were talking about earlier, export of the revolution, what's the ideological complexion of the government and all the rest. So, I mean, if one's job is to inform the policymaker, you have to take on board where they are, which is not to say that you can excuse yourself of talking about other problems that are important, but I would say you have to be much more careful about how you raise that subject, or you won't have a readership, and you won't inform.
Thank you. John, is there anything immediately on this? I'd like to, there's a long list of others who'd like, okay, just briefly then, please.
No problem. Let me ask this question one other way. You know, agency Soviet analysts have spent years tormenting themselves about the San Cristobal trapezoid in the reports on Cuba in 1962. And the economic analysts keep fighting about whether their model of the Soviet economy was correct. The China analysts torment themselves about whether they got it right on the first Chinese atomic bomb tests. What reports do you most regret doing?
It would be down in the weeds. I mean, I can't think right off the top of my head of, boy, we were dead wrong on that issue. John's mentioned the Sandinista loss in the election, the failure to anticipate that on the part of some in the intelligence community. I wasn't working on Nicaragua at that time. But by and large, I would say that there were micro judgments that I think we could do better on, but I think in the macro judgments we did pretty well.
Thank you. Piero and Dr. No, okay. Your shortcomings of the estimates?
Well, I haven't read those estimates, so, but if I can think of one big shortcoming of the CIA, and it really strikes me.
Please talk into the microphone.
Oh, sorry. Is the failure in 1975 to consider the possibility that the Cubans might intervene in Angola. And it is interesting because there is a large paper written by the Davis Task Force in June 1975 that addresses Yugoslavia, East Europeans, the Soviet, what will anyone do? And it doesn't address the Cubans, the role of the Cubans. And it seems to me that that is the CIA in particular that should have brought it to the attention of the higher-ups. You can't expect Kissinger to...
That's a very interesting point, Piero, and I can think of one anecdote on that and maybe try to extrapolate from it. We had a senior Cuban analyst who'd been working the account for a long, long time, and we would get daily reports on Cuban planes flying to Bridgetown in Barbados, usually Bristol Britannias. And this analyst noticed, this was in 75, as I recall, the analyst noticed that planes weren't coming back. I mean, typically, planes flew from Havana, went to Bridgetown, and came back, and he noticed they weren't. And he wrote a draft, not a national intelligence estimate, but a current piece saying, maybe they're going on to Africa. Maybe they're carrying troops. And, you know, mindset is always a problem in the intelligence community and anywhere else, and he couldn't get that.
I don't want to waste anyone's time on this issue, but the problem is not when the Cuban planes start going, and there the CIA, actually the reporting was good, and Kissinger got the reporting immediately, it seems to me. The failure was, the first Cuban troops left on November 7, 1975. The failure was in the summer and in the fall to think about the possibility. Along the same lines, even more striking, the failure of, it seems to me, I may be wrong, I may not have the right documents, the failure of the intelligence community to foresee that the Cubans would intervene in Ethiopia in November 1977. It seems that then again there was a failure. But, you know, I may be wrong on what I'm saying or whatever.
Let me comment just once in terms of the Carter administration. Robert Pastor, who was a Latin American person in the National Security Council, writes in his book, Condemned to Repetition, the U.S. and Nicaragua, that there was no specific policy toward Nicaragua early in the Carter presidency. There were only human rights policies that applied to Nicaragua. Outside of this framework, U.S. relations with Nicaragua received low priority.
Thank you. We have a number of speakers. I'd like to give the Panamanian ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Guillermo Cortés, Ambassador of Panama to the OAS. I will change the subject, the interesting subject we were discussing. I see this is Latin American major developments between 1945 and 1987. What I don't see
is the microphone on? This.
Hello? Yeah. I don't see any reference in these Latin American major developments of some issue that happened in Panama in 1955, the assassination of President Ramon and the visit that year of President Eisenhower to Panama after the assassination. This assassination is still unresolved, and there was some evidence that was a CIA involvement directed and the participation of Vice President Nixon. Probably President Ramon on that time was promoting structural reforms that affects the elites, the national elites, and probably the U.S. companies in Panama. And that is not included here. And I think it's an important episode of probably U.S. intervention in our politics.
Thank you.
Maybe foolishly, could I jump back into Piero's question about failure to anticipate the Cuban involvement militarily in Angola, relying on memory here. But my recollection is, at first, there were pretty small numbers of Cuban military advisors who went to Angola. I think 2,000 was sort of the top figure, and it was creeping up to that. And so one surmises that in retrospect, the Cubans probably looked to see what Washington's reaction was, and when it wasn't that strong, that was one thing that probably fed their confidence to continue getting involved. And then obviously South Africa's intervention in Angola was a second thing. So it's maybe not to excuse things that might have been anticipated. I would just say that the policy context is very important because countries do react to what the U.S. government does. And then secondly, the outside intervention of South Africa would have been a little bit difficult to anticipate. Again, I think as a general statement to state the obvious is when there are discontinuities, major discontinuities, they're hard for anyone to predict. And in the case of Angola, when had the Cubans sent combat troops abroad? You know, it wasn't with people with deep expertise knew what the Cuban experience was up to then, anticipating that they could jump full bore into sending much larger units. Required more imagination than I guess I was confident.
Just one very small thing. Now that the South African archives are open, the South Africa consulted with us about invading Angola, and we gave them the green light. So we knew very well that we weren't taken by surprise. We were in bed with them.
On the ambassador's question, doing one of these timelines is very difficult. I mean, there's so
microphone.
much happening. Doing one of these timelines, Mr. Ambassador, is very difficult, particularly picking the events on the right-hand side here. The main utility that we hope to serve here was to remind people really who was sitting in the White House at the time, to place these papers in that context. So, Riordan, do you want to comment on that? I think one of your people did the timeline.
On the
timeline in the front. The ambassador was talking about the timeline in the front.
primarily because there was very little about Panama.
Yeah,
in the documents that I reviewed.
Yeah, the documents again are not the country in here, and Riordan was working off the documents and constructing this timeline. Again, these are not the country-specific estimates. There were estimates done on individual countries, Panama included, during this time, but they're not in this collection. These are estimates that looked at the region as a whole, that stepped back from a country-specific perspective and looked at insurgency and revolution from a regional context, or in a couple of instances, sub-regional context. So that, I think, explains why Panama isn't there. There weren't any estimates included in Panama in this collection.
Mention to Panama, obviously, for example, Cuban financial assistance is believed to be channeled to the pro-communist National Action Vanguard, the VAN in Panama, a revolutionary group of Marxists active among the peasants. One of the VAN leaders frequently travels to Cuba and claims to be a personal friend of Fidel Castro. That's part of a long review of many of all the countries that were made by in the estimates over time. Very short mentions of what we know at that time about activities, Cuban activities in the region, country by country.
Are there any plans to declassify and make available some of the country-specific estimates?
Chris, do you want to? No, there aren't any plans. We do one collection at a time, and when we finish one, we review the holdings and propose a next topic to Chris and to others. The country-specific, I'm not sure that, with some exceptions, that a country-specific on a Latin American country is in the offing. Lebanon is next, and there are several other candidates out there. We haven't covered Africa at all in these collections, or Europe. Soviet Union's been covered ad nauseum in other releases. No plans. But doesn't mean it won't happen, but no plans.
Okay. Thank you. Jose Raul has been patiently waiting in the back.
Thank you. Jose Raul Perales with the Latin America program. I think some of you may have answered this question, but I'll pose it anyway. In a very superficial reading of this collection, I think I saw the word Grenada mentioned twice or three times. And I just wanted to ask, did the intelligence community play a role in our intervention in Grenada, and what was, or anything in that regard that you may talk about? Thank you.
My recollection on Grenada is that the biggest thing we did was with the captured documents. After Bernard Cohard overthrew Maurice Bishop, there was a treasure trove of documents that were captured, and it was a pretty major effort to extract information from that collection of documents.
And we saw some of these documents coming out of the NIC, but you must have come in late because the Caribbean's not included here. This is Latin America defined by us as Central America and the Cone countries. Caribbean is maybe a topic of another collection. Which
is not to say that Grenada wasn't a subject of focus for lots of current intelligence pieces and pieces done in the intelligence community, just not national intelligence estimates.
Bob, was that on your watch? Do you want to talk about that? Bob Vickers?
Microphone.
I mean, just some generic comments. I mean, I'll address that one, but we were paying very close attention to what was happening in Grenada with the Cubans. The Cubans building the airfield, the relationship with Bishop. We were monitoring that very closely, and I'm sure you know the history of our intervention, but it was true that once the decision was made and we captured a large number of documents, it was a little bit eye-opening. I mean, obviously, the Cubans, at that time, they were getting even more heavily involved in Angola because the South Africans were. And if you read Castro's recent reminiscences, he pens a... I think the Cubans view Angola as maybe their greatest foreign policy success. I mean, and that's where many of the military commanders cut their teeth. The Cubans were hoping to use that airfield to support their effort in Angola. That became even more clear with the captured documents. But just another generic comment. I mean, there are a lot of estimates that we did. I mean, one of the big policy themes in Latin America in the 80s was not only the concern about Soviet and Cuban subversion, it was also one of the U.S. policy anecdotes was to promote democracy and democratic change. And we did a lot of country-specific estimates that looked at, your question about human rights abuses, right-wing military dictatorships. We did an estimate on Panama that it doesn't appear in here that was very critical of the Noriega regime, not just for human rights, but for involvement with drug trafficking, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, there's a lot that could be with this small effort. I mean, the focus of this was obviously, if you look at the title and you look at the estimates that were selected, was the Soviet and then later the Cuban role in promoting subversion. And not to say that we weren't paying attention to democracy and human rights I know in the 80s it was always a partisan issue too on both sides.
Okay. Cindy, directly on this? Okay. Cindy Arnson.
I hear what you're saying, and I still want to point out that in 1982, the perceived politicization of intelligence had become so acute that a subcommittee of the House Intelligence Committee put out specifically a report indicating the extent to which the focus of intelligence gathering was directed towards these issues of Cuban and Soviet subversion and not towards human rights and right-wing violence. That was a report, Chris, you may remember this as well as I do, put out by a subcommittee on oversight of the House Intelligence Committee, where they took the intelligence community to task for not investigating the largest massacre in recent, Latin American history, the massacre at El Mozote, the faulty intelligence or the lack of intelligence that stood behind completely misleading statements that were made to the Congress, the relative lack of attention on right-wing death squad violence in El Salvador, which was at its height between 1981 and then towards 1983, when at the time, Vice President Bush went down. So, again, people made reference to the fact that different people wearing different sets of glasses were looking at the intelligence in a particular way. But I think that, in fairness to the record, there was an intense debate over whether the correct questions were being asked. And I, with all due respect, Patrick, I just don't think that it does justice to the issue to say, well, William Casey knew that there were social and human rights problems. What we really wanted to know was the Cuban and Nicaraguan involvement. Well, I think the reality was that there was not enough known about the nature of these governments and of their links to the death squads and the infiltration of the security forces. And these were the forces that we were supporting in an attempt, to prevent the radical revolutionary left from coming to power and to, build a democratic system. So, the record's a lot more mixed, I guess, is the bottom line.
I mentioned that what really is important in these documents, I think, is at the time in which the estimates are very clear. The dangerously unstable situation that prevails throughout much of Latin America is a product of fundamental inequities and historic circumstances. It is not the creation of Castro and the Soviets, unquote.
What year is that?
62. That was in the middle of the Alliance for Progress. But what's interesting is that about the same time, the U.S. was deeply involved in Asia, creating the Asian Tigers. And the U.S. supported what? In Korea, for example, land reform, which we did not in 1954 in Guatemala. The U.S. supported a whole series of structural changes that made the Asian Tiger countries increasingly competitive. We supported adding value to exports. We did a series of things that we would not think about doing in Latin America, as the early quotes I mentioned in the analysis I did, not in the estimates. But the estimates point out time and time again, don't blame the Cubans, don't blame the Soviets, blame the Latinos. Why aren't they doing something to reform their countries? And they weren't. The only opening we had, and the estimates are, I think, quite positive here, is the Alliance of Progress. But that, of course, died with President Kennedy. And we don't know what would have happened with the alliance if it had gone on. But the estimates going forward to the White House at this time are very clear. And the White House must have responded in some way. I do not know how. I don't know if there are any memoirs about this or not. But quite clearly, the alliance is based upon this issue, that we need to be concerned about what's happening or what is not happening in the region to address some of these questions.
All right. There are several people who have been patiently waiting. Mel Leffler, the gentleman on the right, and then Mircea. So we'll go first to Mel Leffler, collect a few questions now.
I'm Mel Leffler. I'm a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center this year. I'd just like to follow up on Cindy's question and press you, Patrick, a little bit further. On the one hand, it's been said here, and I definitely believe this, that the culture of the CIA is to impress analysts, not to be influenced by political considerations. The analysts I've known over the years have definitely embraced that as their ethos. On the other hand, you so pointedly say, well, we knew what people like Bill Casey wanted. We knew what policymakers were interested in. We want our reports to be salient, so we respond to the policymakers. I'd just like to ask you to reflect on those two conflicting impulses and how you really respond. There's no clear answer to that. This is a genuine dilemma. But I'd like you to reflect a little bit more about how, in everyday life, you, as analysts, respond to those conflicting pressures.
All right, hold on. We'll take a couple of questions first. Yep. Across the table.
My name is Paul Wee, Elliott School, George Washington University. My question is along the very same line as the last two speakers. When Cindy Aronson mentioned the El Mozote massacre in El Salvador, this was a horrible event that was only really publicized when I think it was Raymond Bonner brought out the stories. But the non-governmental organizations, churches and others, knew about this. They knew about this, and I was one of those. And you go to the State Department Central Affairs office and describe what had happened in El Mozote. And continually, it was basically a rebuff. And I can name names, but I won't do that. But the principle is the same. I note now that some of the leaders of military dictatorships in, for example, Argentina in the late 70s, now before tribunals, say quite openly, we felt we had a carte blanche from the U.S. They quote Henry Kissinger. There was an overarching ideological framework superimposed on a very complex reality in Argentina, and then one could talk about El Salvador and Guatemala. But this same dichotomy, this same tension seems to run through all of these situations. On the one hand, the ideological aim to stop communists in the Western Hemisphere versus dealing with the root causes of social, economic injustice, unemployment, poverty, and the like. I guess my question is then, how is this tension dealt with, or how do the analysts communicate about these issues to the policymakers?
Thank you. Mircea?
Mircea Montano from the Cultural International History Project. I want to follow up a little bit on what Mel said just a few minutes ago, and that is to say, okay, let's assume that all the judgments on the NIEs were correct, but then as Pierre Glahisis mentioned, there's a disconnect between the NIEs and the policy decisions later on. So I'm wondering, how do you deal with that particular, and why is there that particular disconnect in there between the judgments of the intelligence community as a whole and the policymakers' decision? That is not to say that you can force the policy decision maker to take your judgment, but the fact that they're not taking them into account to their fullest seems to be a problem. We've heard that again and again over the course of history, not just on Latin America, but on Iraq and the Middle East and so on. So I'm wondering, why is there that disconnect, and more importantly, is it because the NIEs are then drowned out by current intelligence, the constant flow of current intelligence or other intelligence products from the community that basically just drown out the NIEs, or is there something else?
All right, thank you. I think there was a question on the left. We'll go and take this one as well, and then we'll go to a final round of responses from the panels.
My question relates to the
independent. Please introduce yourself.
Cole Blazier. I worked on this subject all my life. What about the independence of the intelligence community vis-a-vis the executive branch? And I'd like to hear, especially from those of you who are running these programs and your relationships with them. I know it's probably there's no perfect world, but especially there. I sense we have to accept the fact that to some extent you're instruments of the political forces that are type of the government. How did it go? Tell us about some of those.
Thank you.
Maybe I could, Bob, feel free to join in because you were active during this period too. Say just a couple of things to Cole Blazier's last comment. I think, a lot of us remember that there are different stages as intelligence analysts over the years. One where we were pretty distant from the policy community. We would throw our papers over the transom, as people would say, and hope that it was useful.
Microphone.
More recent years, we've been much closer to the policy community, going down to brief the senior director for Inter-American Affairs, having relations with the assistant secretary, making sure we knew what was on his agenda so we could provide intelligence that would be insightful on that topic. And I guess I fall into the camp thinking that second approach is good. Dan certainly never would have told us what to say. We tried to tell truth to power as best as we could. But I think the fact that we had that interaction gave us a chance to help inform policymakers' thinking on what was going on in Latin America that the previous period didn't allow us to do at all. And I didn't find it a politicizing experience on any occasion. I guess another thing I would say, and maybe I'm just repeating what's been said already, but if you have a volume that looks at armed struggle, you're going to have a lot of papers on armed struggle. If you had a volume that looks at support for right-wing terrorism, I'd be interested. It's an open question for me, but I think there'd be a fair amount of information that would fill that volume. Bob, what's your response?
Very briefly, though, because...
Yeah, I mean... looking at the last 3 or 4 estimates or products, I mean, those were asked for. The topic was asked to be addressed by the DCI. You may remember that Casey was the first DCI who became a member of the cabinet. He was a cabinet member. He sat on the National Security Council. And, he was responding to the policy concerns of the administration. But I know, I'll support, and to some extent, okay, we know the topic that they want addressed. And in many cases, you might say, we think we know what they want to hear. But we tried to be, if you read these estimates, particularly the later ones, we laid out the evidence much more extensively. I think you mentioned this already. Because we knew that people were going to be challenging us. What evidence do you have to support these? In terms of the questions about human rights, right-wing dictatorships, et cetera, we weren't asked to do estimates on those except in particular country-specific cases. I mentioned Panama. But I know that anybody who was an analyst working in Latin America was concerned with human rights, with democratic development. Like I said, there was a big push to replace military dictatorships with democratic governments. And a lot of our intelligence products were looking at that issue. Could we have done better? Well, understand the context that we were working in. And I think that, I know there's papers. I had to do an estimate on the prospects for the Contras. I think it's not in here. As I recall, it said that their prospects were not very good at all. I don't know that, I'm sure the administration didn't want to hear that, but that was our objective judgment. And I'm kind of proud that we did. We tried as best we could to tell truth to power, as Pat said.
Bob's talking about one period that's particularly ticklish, I think, and that was the period when CIA had a task force that was supporting the Contras. And the notion that the intelligence analysts should have their pieces coordinated with the task force, I think that was a mistake, frankly, because you can't expect objectivity from a group of people who are trying to help a group attain power, or I think my point's obvious. But that's the only period I can remember in Latin America where that problem arose, and that was that the clandestine services were involved in supporting a particular group, and to ask them to pass judgment on our analysis was ipso facto politicization, in my humble opinion.
You know,
Yeah, John, go ahead.
Stepping back from this particular period on Nicaragua,
Microphone, John.
the answer to the question of how do you communicate to policymakers in this charged atmosphere, the answer, to be flip, is very carefully. What you don't do, and what the analysts don't do in these estimates, is tell, hey, dear policymaker, you're wrong about the Cubans and Soviets and what they're doing there in Latin America. There's a regional dynamic at work that has to do with maldistribution of wealth and social. You don't do that. You say the Cubans and the Soviets are there. There's evidence that they're there, and maybe you spin that out a little bit, but then you throw the hook in, and you say, but that's not the most important thing at work. And I see this in the early, and Reardon maybe quoted the exception in there, where you flat out tell, that quote you had was flat out telling the policymaker, it isn't the Cubans, the Soviets. You handle it very delicately. Or you make yourself irrelevant. I worked on Vietnam during the Vietnam crisis, and that's Exhibit A of where we made ourselves irrelevant on the issue of bombing of the North. They didn't listen.
Thank you. Chairman Corson?
Yeah, two comments in brief, really just reinforcing what Pat and John have already said. In response to Cole's question, intelligence it's not an abstract research function. It exists to support a policy purpose. And the questioners about topics largely come from the executive branch. But if Congress does not like the work, Congress can and does direct work on national intelligence estimates. And so there are checks and balances here. Just a word about the relationship of policy and intelligence. There's a bright blue line between analysis and policy, and we don't cross that line. We don't make policy recommendations. But we get right up to that line because otherwise we're not relevant in supporting the process of policy making. In response to the question about, well, what happens to these NIEs and what do you do when policymakers don't listen to them? Well, look, I'm going to say, and I do believe, NIEs are important. They are read, key judgments are read by policymakers. They are documents that are taken seriously. But the point is, intelligence, even in the form of an estimate, is only one input in the policy process. And policymakers have lots of contacts across the international community, lots of inputs coming in. Yes, there is domestic politics as well. That all figures in the process. So, you know, we've got to understand our proper role here and have a little bit of modesty that on tough, ambiguous questions, we're simply making our best judgment. We may not necessarily be right. It's fortunate when we can look back 20 or 30 years later and see the quality of the work done. But, you know, there are no certitudes in this process, even when we give our best judgment with the highest confidence. So policymakers, I think we have to understand and afford them ample latitude to reflect on what we provide as one input, an important one, but by no means an exclusive one in the making of policy.
Thank you very much. Piero.
Yeah, on this question on this question of pressure from above on the analysts, I have a question for Pat that probably reflects my ignorance. If I remember correctly, during Reagan's first term, you had what seemed to me a very forceful division chief, Byron Jackson, and a strong deputy division chief, Yvonne Peterson. And I had a feeling they were a little bit also a shield and a protection. And in 1985, they both got out of the line of fire. Byron went to Treasury and Yvonne to the Inspector's General Office. Did this change anything in terms of the situation the analysts were in?
You know, those were two outstanding people, but I think the institution They were both outstanding people, but I think the institution has tended to produce more people like that, whose function in part is to protect their analysts from pressure, particularly from outside the intelligence community.
Thank you. Ward, any final words?
Even when there was great skepticism in Washington in the mid-1980s, the second to last estimate I reviewed in July of 1986, again, very prescient, very straight on. The general conclusion is, I quote, despite the expected extent of insurgent activity, no leftist revolutionary movement is likely to come to power in South America during the next few years. They were absolutely right, because the democratic process had begun, beginning in 1983 with the restoration of democracy in Argentina, followed by a democracy in Brazil in 1985, and going down the line. So again, the impression I get out is that if policymakers had listened more to these estimates, U.S. foreign policy might well not have made many of the mistakes that it did.
Just one other quick point, if I could make it, and that is, I'm afraid some of you will go away thinking what a bunch of cocky people those people are from the intelligence community. They never got anything wrong. That's crazy. I mean, if you're a serious analyst, every day you think about what I produced, last week. Was it accurate? What does this new piece of intelligence tell us that either substantiate or negates what we're saying? So it's a constant sort of process, as it is with any serious analyst.
Thank you very much. Lots of questions that we can't get to. I apologize to those who didn't get to ask their questions. Clearly, the I think very animated and good discussion shows the need for further meetings such as this, and the need for further releases such as the ones that's presented today. Thank all of you for your questions and contributions. But let's give a round of applause to the panelists for their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thanks for your work.
Yeah,
On
my
to
pleasure.
the next one.
On to the next.
Yeah. So you're working full time?
I'm working full time at Homeland Security.
Thank you for your work on this project.
Very interesting. It's a lot of fun.
I can imagine. And what happened to Francisco?
Francisco, I think, is in North Carolina.
So retired, something.
Hello.
Mark, nice to meet you.
Oh, that was great. I don't want to be late for him twice. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. We hope to continue this.